My name is Margaret, and I'll never forget the moment my heart cracked in two. I was standing in my own kitchen, pouring coffee, when I heard the young woman my son loved whisper under her breath in French. She thought I couldn't understand her. She thought those words would slide right past me, but I speak enough French to know exactly what she said. She called me an old, ugly cow. For a second, I froze. My hands trembled as I gripped the mug, pretending nothing had happened. The sting cut deeper than I can explain. This was the woman my son wanted to marry, the one he swore was kind and genuine. And here she was, smiling sweetly to his face, but spitting venom behind my back. The room suddenly felt colder. My mind raced with questions I couldn't silence. Who was she really? What else was she hiding, and why? Deep down, did I feel this wasn't just a slip of the tongue, but the tip of something darker? I didn't say a word in that moment. I just tucked it away, telling myself I'd keep watching, keep listening. That single insult planted a seed of doubt, one that would grow into the storm that nearly tore our family apart. And to understand how it all unraveled, the lies, the danger, and the painful truth, I need to take you back to the very beginning. Let me tell you how it all started. I'm Margaret. I'm 64 years old, a widow for nearly a decade now, living quietly in Austin. My days had settled into a kind of rhythm gardening in the mornings, phone calls with my sister in the afternoons, and evenings often spent alone with a book or a show. Life was steady, calm, even if it sometimes felt a little empty. My son, David, is the brightest part of my world. He's 35 now, a hard-working engineer, the kind of man who always shows up for others but never seemed to find someone who showed up for him. For years, I prayed he'd meet someone kind, someone who truly saw his heart. And then, one day, he walked into my kitchen with Camille. She was breathtaking dark hair that framed her face in soft waves, a smile that seemed to light up the room, and a French accent that made everything she said sound elegant. She carried herself with a quiet grace, the kind of presence that makes people lean in just to listen. David looked at her like she was the answer to every lonely moment he'd ever had. And honestly, in that first meeting, I let myself believe she might be. Our first family dinner felt almost magical. I set the table with my mother's old china, and the soft glow of candles gave the room a golden warmth. The air was filled with laughter, stories, and the easy kind of comfort that only comes when love is in the room. Watching David and Camille together, my heart softened. I remember thinking maybe this was it. Maybe my son had finally found someone who would love him the way he deserved. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to exhale, to imagine a future where holidays weren't just the two of us, but a growing family, filled with joy. But looking back now, I realized that warmth, that trust, was fragile. What seemed perfect at that dinner table was only the beginning of something far more complicated, and that fragile peace would not last. From the very first minutes of that dinner, Camille had a way of putting everyone at ease. She leaned in when people spoke, as if every word mattered. She asked thoughtful questions, sprinkled with little stories from her life in France, some light-hearted, some filled with a kind of charm that made me picture cobblestone streets and cafes I had only ever seen in movies. She helped me carry dishes to the table without needing to be asked. She complimented the roast chicken, not in a rehearsed way, but with such enthusiasm it made me blush. She even teased David just enough to make him laugh, and I remember watching his face light up in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. There was a grace about her, an ease that made me think she could slide into our family without effort. My sister, who had joined us for dinner, whispered later that Camille seemed like a dream come true. And in that moment, I agreed. For the first time in years, I felt the heavy worry I carried for my son begin to lift. I told myself I could finally stop praying so hard for him to find someone kind. Maybe my prayers had already been answered. I caught myself picturing holidays filled with grandchildren, the sound of more laughter around this same table, and even the possibility of not feeling so alone in this big house anymore. The warmth in the room wrapped around me like a blanket. I let myself believe, truly, believe that my son had finally found his person. And for those moments, it felt like everything had fallen into place. But I have to be honest with you. That happiness, that fragile sense of peace, did not last. In fact, it only held for exactly 47 minutes. And what happened next shattered every bit of trust I thought I had found. After dinner, the house was calm. David was in the living room putting on music, and Camille excused herself, phone in hand, drifting toward the hallway. I stayed in the kitchen, rinsing plates, enjoying that small satisfaction of a meal well shared. The sound of running water and clinking dishes filled the room, steady and ordinary. For a moment, everything felt settled. Then I heard her voice, soft at first, in French, a language I don't speak fluently but know well enough. My ears caught certain words, clear as day. Green card, money, 2 years. I froze, my hands still wet with soap. I leaned just enough to hear better, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out the hum of the refrigerator. She laughed light, almost musical as she spoke into the phone. And in that laugh, wrapped inside those words, I understood the plan. David wasn't her forever. He was her ticket. The man I raised, the man I prayed would find love, was nothing more than a stepping stone. She would take what she needed, his kindness, his devotion, his resources, and when the time was right, she'd leave. The plate slipped from my hand and shattered on the tile. The crash jolted me, but not as much as the truth I had just swallowed. My body shook as I knelt to gather the pieces, my mind racing. My son's happiness, the fragile hope I had built up around this woman, had just been smashed like that porcelain. I wanted to storm into the hallway, to scream, to drag her out of my house. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I took deep breaths, steadied my hands, and forced myself to move slowly, as if nothing had changed. I wiped the counter. I dried my hands. I pasted on a smile when David looked my way. Inside, though, I was collapsing. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. Not only had Camille fooled my son, she had fooled me too. And now I carried this secret, this unbearable truth, alone. I knew in that instant that everything from this point forward would be different. I would have to watch, to listen, to find out how deep her lies went. But above all, I had to protect my son, even if it meant pretending nothing had happened. That night, as the house grew quiet again, I made a silent promise I wouldn't let Camille ruin him, not without a fight. And with that vow heavy in my chest, I stepped carefully into the shadows of what would become the most dangerous investigation of my life. I wanted to tell David everything that night. The words sat heavy on my tongue, but then I pictured his face, his excitement, his certainty that Camille was the one. If I accused her without proof, he'd only pull further away from me. I couldn't risk losing him. So I swallowed the truth and promised myself I'd find evidence first. The next morning, I began my own investigation. I searched Camille's social media, scrolling past carefully staged photos and captions that seemed almost too polished. Still, small cracks appeared. Names tagged that didn't match stories she had told us. Locations that didn't line up with the timeline she had shared. At first, it felt like nothing more than inconsistencies. But the deeper I dug, the darker it became. I called my niece, Claire, who works at the State Department. I confided just enough to make her understand my worry. She hesitated, but eventually agreed to look quietly into immigration records. A few days later, she called me back, her voice low, almost frightened. Camille had entered the U.S. under a different last name. And before that, she had a record in Europe, a short-lived marriage that ended abruptly, flagged by authorities as a possible sham. My heart raced. It wasn't just my imagination. I wasn't overreacting. Still, I needed more. I hired a private investigator, a man named Keller, who specialized in international fraud. He started tracing her past. Each update chipped away at the woman I thought I knew. Camille had changed her name 3 times. She had married twice before in different countries, each time leaving her partners financially ruined. And the worst revelation, she was connected to a network that orchestrated marriage scams across borders. I remember sitting alone in my living room, the blinds drawn. Keller's report spread out across the coffee table. Page after page confirmed what I dreaded. Camille wasn't just a selfish opportunist. She was part of something organized, predatory, and dangerous. The fear that gripped me wasn't just about my son's broken heart anymore. It was about his safety, his future, and the trap he was already tangled in. Every time Camille smiled at me across the dinner table, every time she touched David's hand, I felt the chill of her lies. But I stayed quiet, forcing myself to play along until the right moment came. I knew I'd have to face her eventually, but not without a plan. That plan took shape sooner than I expected. Camille invited us to a formal dinner to introduce her parents, who had flown in from France. Something about the way she arranged it set off alarms in my gut. And as I prepared for that night, I realized this would be the moment I had to watch her most closely. Because deep down, I already suspected those so-called parents weren't who they claimed to be. The evening began with soft lighting, the kind meant to make everyone feel comfortable. Camille was radiant, glowing with a kind of confidence that made my skin crawl. She introduced her parents with dramatic flair, her hand resting on David's arm as if to remind him how lucky he was. I smiled politely, even as my chest tightened. These were the people I needed to see clearly. They looked the part, dressed elegantly, carrying themselves with the sort of practiced grace one expects from well-traveled Europeans. But something felt rehearsed, like a play being staged just for us. I waited, biding my time, letting the conversation unfold around the table. Then, with my calmest voice, I slipped into French. I asked about their hometown, about life in Marseille, the city Camille had always claimed they were from. For a split second, I caught the flicker in their eyes, the hesitation, and then the answer came too polished, too quick. They described Paris, not Marseille, Paris streets, Paris culture, Paris food, not one detail about the southern port city Camille had woven into her stories. My stomach turned cold. In that instant, The last sliver of doubt vanished. They weren't her parents. They weren't even from Marseille. I forced myself to keep smiling, nodding as if enchanted by their tales. But inside, I was cataloging every inconsistency, every slip. The clink of silverware and the low hum of conversation felt suddenly sharp, like a knife's edge pressing against me. And then Camille, drunk on her own performance, made her mistake. She let slip a grand announcement, delivered with the sweetness of a secret she couldn't quite contain. Their engagement and wedding were set for Christmas. My breath caught. David looked stunned, but she brushed past it, spinning it as a romantic surprise. For me, it was confirmation. Proof layered on top of proof. The fake parents, the fabricated past, the rush toward a holiday wedding, it all formed a noose tightening around my son. That night, as dessert was served and everyone laughed too loudly, I made a silent promise. The act had gone on long enough. I had seen enough. It was time to do more than just watch. It was time to act. Because if Camille thought she could trap David with a Christmas wedding, she had no idea that I was already planning how to expose her. I knew I couldn't let this charade go on any longer. Every instinct in me screamed to tell David the truth, but I also knew my son. He was blinded by love, and if I tried to convince him without proof, he would push me away. So I chose silence with him and action in the shadows. The private investigator became my lifeline. Every report he sent me confirmed what I already feared, but it also gave me strength. And then came the meeting with immigration officials. I remember sitting across from them, my hands folded tightly to hide the trembling. We laid out Camille's history aliases, fraudulent marriages, financial schemes. Piece by piece, the mask she wore was stripped away. Together, we built a plan. Christmas dinner would no longer be just a holiday meal. It would be the stage where Camille revealed her true self. The investigator would be there, officials nearby, ready to step in when the moment came. My role was to keep calm, play the gracious hostess, and wait for her to slip. It terrified me. The idea of orchestrating something so delicate while my son sat unaware beside her. In the quiet moments, I questioned myself. Was I doing the right thing? Would David hate me for what I was about to expose? But then I would see his face in my mind. That boy I had raised, trusting so deeply in the wrong person. And I knew I had no choice. As the days ticked down to Christmas, every hour felt heavier. The tree went up, the lights sparkled, and carols played softly in the background. But beneath the warmth of the season, I carried a secret battle plan. On Christmas night, the truth would come out, and I had to be ready to see my son's world break, so I could save him before it was too late. Christmas night glowed with a kind of fragile perfection. The tree sparkled in the corner, candles flickered on the table, and David's hand brushed against his pocket more than once. I knew what he was hiding, the family ring, the one his father once promised would pass down to the woman who would share his life. My heart ached at the thought. For a moment, I let myself believe he would still get his fairy tale. And then the knock came, sharp, commanding. The door opened, and in stepped the agents, their presence slicing through the warmth like ice water. Camille froze, her smile cracking. I could see the mask slipping even before they spoke her name. It happened so fast. She tried to laugh it off, but when the agents laid the evidence in front of her, the sweetness vanished. What replaced it was venom. She spat her words out like poison, dropping the act completely. She mocked David, calling him an easy mark. She confessed without shame that the woman he thought he loved never existed, that she had stolen the identity of another Camille in France long ago. I watched David's face crumble in slow motion. His hand still hovered near his pocket, but now the ring was nothing more than a cruel reminder. His eyes darted to me, and in that look I saw not just heartbreak, but fury. Fury that I had known. Fury that for 3 weeks I had carried this knowledge alone. My son, my gentle boy, stood in the wreckage of his trust, and I stood powerless, caught between relief that the truth was finally exposed and grief at the cost it demanded. The dinner had begun as a celebration. It ended in ashes. David's silence was heavier than any words, and I knew the hardest part was yet to come. Because what had been broken that night was not just a relationship. It was his faith in love, and in me, and healing that would take far longer than any Christmas night. When the door finally closed behind the agents and Camille was gone, the house felt unbearably silent. The lights on the tree still twinkled, but they seemed hollow, mocking. David sat there with his head in his hands, the ring still in his pocket, but its meaning shattered. I wished I could take his pain and carry it myself. Instead, I sat with him in that quiet, knowing there were no words that could undo the wound. In the weeks that followed, healing was not easy. David struggled with trust, with the shame of being deceived, and with the anger of realizing I had known more than I let on. I carried my own guilt, but also a strange sense of peace. I had done what I had to do to protect him, even if it meant he hated me for a time. Slowly, through late-night talks and quiet mornings, we began to piece ourselves back together. This experience taught me something that I believe is worth sharing. Love can make us blind, but family can be the anchor that pulls us back when we drift too far. Trust is precious, and once broken, it takes time to rebuild. But even betrayal can't erase the bond between a mother and her child. So if you're listening to this, let our story remind you, stay open-hearted, but don't ignore the signs. Protect the people you love, even when it's hard. And if this story moved you, take a moment to like, share, and leave a comment. Maybe together, we can help others see the warning signs before it's too late.